Hi guys, Mr. Fowler here, and I'm going to be walking you through the Bill of Rights, which are the first 10 amendments to the U.S. Constitution. There's a lot of important aspects that we need to cover in this, some really important things that you guys need to know, so let's go ahead and dive right into it. All right, so the first amendment is the amendment that protects against our freedom of expression. So there's a couple of different aspects to this that are really key. First is freedom of religion. So under the First Amendment, it protects individuals to worship however they please. So it doesn't matter what religion you follow. The First Amendment protects you, gives you the ability to do that. And it also protects from there being a state religion. So there's no government affiliated religion. So that's part of that First Amendment right there. You also have the freedom of speech and press. And we'll talk a little bit more about that here in a second. But basically, individuals can openly express their opinions and criticize their government how they feel. But there is some limitations to that. We'll talk about that in just a second. You also have the freedom of assembly, which means groups can come together and protest and discuss the government in a peaceful manner. One caveat to that is you may need to obtain a permit to do so, because some areas, there are local laws that don't allow for mass gatherings, or if it's anything that could prohibit or endanger the safety of the public, then it might not be allowed. And freedom of petition. So this is where you can write to the government and criticize their actions. You don't like what the government's doing, you are allowed to go ahead and write to them and tell them that. All right. So let's get into the freedom of speech and press a little bit deeper. So I mentioned that there are some limitations to that First Amendment right of freedom of speech and press. There are laws that prohibit slander and libel. So just make sure you understand what the difference between those two are. Slander is any false speech that is intended to damage a person's reputation. You can't, falsely accuse somebody of having, you can't say somebody has horns growing out of the head when, they don't necessarily have that. That's a false interpretation of who they are. And then the written aspect, libel, is the same thing, but the only difference is slander is spoken, libel is written. So libel is that false written or published statements intended to damage a person's reputation. So that's why you can't, write to a newspaper and talk ill of someone with the sole purpose of trying to hurt their reputation. So there are libel laws that protect individuals that way. And so it's important to understand what those two words are and how they impact freedom of speech and freedom of press. For the most part, though, they are most speech and written items are protected under the First Amendment. Only when you get to really big, egregious errors do you have situations where slander and libel come into play. All right, moving on. The Second Amendment. A lot of people are familiar with the Second Amendment, and this is commonly referred to as the right to bear arms. This was originally in a response to the British and in the American Revolution. The terminology used in the amendment is right to a well-regulated militia. Obviously, today, by today's standards, we do have a well-regulated militia. It's the National Guard, but the Supreme Court has expanded its interpretation of the right to bear arms to cover individuals who own firearms. So a lot of people who own firearms in their home for sporting purposes can also claim the Second Amendment to protect the use of those arms for their own personal self-defense. Okay. Moving on to the Third Amendment. This one's pretty straightforward. So just the straight verbiage from the Bill of Rights says, no soldier shall in time of peace be quartered in any house without the consent of the owner, nor in time of war, but in a manner to be prescribed by law. Basically, this is a response to the American Revolution when the British were taking over people's homes, and the soldiers were staying in people's homes even though they didn't want them there. So this is a direct result of that. So basically saying that the government can't force you to hold soldiers in your home unless it is prescribed by law. So the government can't come in and say, hey, these soldiers need a place to stay, we're going to take over your house. They can't do that unless there's martial law, which is usually where the military takes control of the government and says, we need to, for security purposes, we need to have this. But again, it's very, very rare for that to occur. All right, so that's the Third Amendment. No quartering of troops is usually what it's referred to. Fourth Amendment, again, this one is pretty straightforward as well. The Fourth Amendment protects against the unreasonable search and seizures of private property. Again, this is another response to the American Revolution and British colonial rule. The Founding Fathers didn't want private property to be searched through by the government. Police need to have what's called probable cause. So if they think that you might have committed a crime, then they have probable cause to go ahead and go through your private property, whether it be your home, your car, your person, looking through your coat pockets and stuff like that. They need to have that probable cause. And for bigger searches, they need to have that search warrant, which is signed off by a judge saying, okay, there's enough evidence, we believe there's enough evidence that we can go ahead and put in for the search warrant to look for possible evidence. The Fifth Amendment, this one's kind of big. There's a lot of protections that go into this one. There are four main protections within the Fifth Amendment. The first is no one can be tried of a serious crime unless a grand jury has decided that there is enough evidence. So basically, you can't be put on trial unless it's believed that there's enough evidence to do so. To go along with that, the next big protection of the Fifth Amendment is no person who's been found innocent of a crime can be tried for that same offense twice. So say, for instance, if somebody is tried for murder of an individual, they can't be tried again for murder of that individual for the exact same thing. So this is known as double jeopardy. It protects against double jeopardy, meaning you can't be tried twice for the same crime. A famous example of this is the O.J. Simpson trial. So, for instance, famous O.J. Simpson trial was a criminal trial where he was accused of murdering his ex-wife, and he was found innocent, or I should say not guilty of that. Well, they couldn't go ahead and try him again for that because it was a murder trial, so they tried it as a civil trial, and he was found guilty in the civil trial. So that's the case where he was able, the court was able to try him again, but it was for a different situation. It wasn't a criminal charge, it was a civil charge, so there was a difference there. The third protection for the Fifth Amendment is no one may be forced to testify against him herself. So this is where you have people usually refer to them as pleading the fifth. I plead the fifth, meaning, I can't give up any information that would be incriminating upon myself. And then lastly is the Fifth Amendment sets up, the government may not deprive life, liberty, or property without due process of the law. Meaning, everybody has to go through the proper channels. You have to have the constitutional requirements fulfilled. It also sets up the government's right to eminent domain, which is the power of the government to take away private property for public use. But in that, there are caveats to that, meaning they need to follow the proper steps to do so. It has to be for the public good. They have to pay a fair market price if they're going to take the land away. And it's usually for things like highways, dams, that sort of thing. So stuff that would benefit the greater good. They can't just take your land away just because they want it. They need to be able to prove that they're doing something for the public for that. The Sixth Amendment. Okay, so we're starting to talk about amendments that deal with courts and trials. This one protects against individuals charged with crimes you're allowed to a speedy and public trial, meaning that you're not going to sit in jail forever waiting for your trial, and you're going to be tried in front of your peers. There are some other protections that go along with that. You can ask, if you're accused, you can ask for trial to be by judge alone. Possibly you don't want to have trial by jury. And we'll talk about the Seventh Amendment, which talks about that a little bit more. You can ask for a change in venue, say if it's in a location where you feel like it is unfavorable publicly. You can go ahead and ask that to be changed. It also protects the right. You have the right to know what you're being charged of, so you can build a defense. And you have the right to hear all questions and answers from witnesses, as well as the right to be defended by a lawyer. Those are all protected under the Sixth Amendment. I mentioned the Seventh Amendment, and this one basically just assures that you have the right to trial by jury in any cases that are involving the common law, which just means any law that's established in a previous court case is common law. The Eighth Amendment, this one protects against excessive bail and cruel and unusual punishment. So judges can't hand out a sentence, in a fine that is so great that you can't pay it back, even after you've served your time. So say they sentence you to a max sentence of 20 years and a fine of $1 million. The likelihood of you being able to pay that all back when you get out of your sentence is very unlikely. So this protects against that from happening. And then cruel and unusual punishment. So they can't send you to jail for 15 years if you steal a candy bar. That would be cruel and unusual punishment for that crime. You have a lot of debate about the death penalty in recent years. Would that be considered cruel and unusual punishment? There have been some court cases that have tried to rule against this, but there has been no precedent set for that, for cruel and unusual punishment. The last two amendments that we got here are sort of open-ended. The Ninth Amendment basically says that people's rights are not restricted to those specified in Amendments 1 through 8. So basically, meaning you have more rights than what is listed in 1 through 8. We wanted to make sure that 1 through 8 were specifically listed, but number 9 comes in to say those are important, but you have more that might not be in there. So you have more rights than what are specifically in there. And the Founding Fathers wanted to do this because they recognize that there might be other issues, there might be other rights that come up that might not be specifically listed. And they didn't want to have any issues saying, somebody saying, well, it's not in the Bill of Rights, so therefore you don't have that right. So they put this in there as sort of a caveat saying, well, there are other rights, and it's, the people have them. And that leads to number 10, which is kind of another open-ended one. And this reaffirms federalism. Remember, federalism is that idea of the sharing of power between the federal government and the state government. And it basically states that the powers not granted to the national government and not prohibited by the state governments are reserved to the states and to the people. So basically, any powers that are not written in the Constitution, the states have that power. So you have a lot of those. That's where you have that sharing of power between the state and the national government for those. All right, guys, that's all we had for today. Hopefully you guys have a better understanding of the Bill of Rights. And if you guys have any questions, remember, always reach out to your teachers for more help. Thanks, guys. We'll see you next time.